Okay, today's video lesson is on the plasma membrane. And we know all living things have a plasma membrane. So it's something that every single living organism has. What is a plasma membrane? It's a very thin layer of lipids and proteins that separates the cell from its contents around it. So there's an inside to the cell and an outside the cell, and the item that separates the two is the cell membrane. It's called selectively permeable because it lets some things cross it, but not all things cross it. It creates a barrier between the cell contents and the outside environment. There are four parts to the plasma membrane. It's also known as a cell membrane. The first part is the phospholipids, and as you can see here in the diagram, they look like kind of balloons with two strings attached to them. And the plasma membrane has two layers of them, the top layer and the bottom layer. So we call that a bilayer of phospholipids. It also has proteins. They're large substances that interdisperse throughout the membrane. It has carbohydrates and it has steroids. All of these components are in constant motion and constant movement. So we call it fluid. And they can, sometimes the parts can be closer together or slightly apart from each other, and it depends on the temperature. The closer together they are, the colder it is usually, and the warmer they are, they get a little bit farther apart. So in between these phospholipids is where certain substances can pass through, and then also they'll be allowed to pass through these proteins. So that gets us to the job of the cell membrane. It's going to control what enters and leaves the cell. We call it semi-permeable or selectively permeable because it allows certain things to pass and prevents other things from passing. Things that can easily get across are very small molecules like carbon dioxide and oxygen. Things that can't get across, that usually need some kind of assistance or help, will be larger molecules. Things like complex carbohydrates or complex polysaccharide, which would be saccharide and polypeptides. So we need to talk about how do things get across that plasma membrane. And it's a little bit tricky on how that occurs. So there are basically four ways that things move across a plasma membrane. The first way is passively. In other words, no energy is going to be exerted, and that would include diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. And then the last way is active transport. And just like the word sounds active, you've got to actively do something to get something across the membrane. So let's look at passive transport. And by definition, it means the movement of substances across a membrane without energy. There's three types: diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion. So there's one more word we have to talk about before we can actually talk about diffusion, and that is the term concentration gradient. It's a vocabulary word you really want to understand. It's not too difficult. So if you look at my diagram over here on the right-hand side, I have side A and side B. It's like a box, and I have a membrane separating the two. On one side, on side A, I have lots of dots. And on side B, I have not so many dots. So these are considered, I'm going to call those molecules. So on this side, I would consider this a high concentration of molecules and a low concentration of molecules, and this membrane separates them. So when you have a situation where you have different amounts of something on either side of a barrier, we call that a concentration gradient. Because on this side, you have more molecules than you do on that side. And in nature, everything wants to be in balance or reach equilibrium. So these are generally, the high concentration is going to move to the low concentration. But in general, when we talk about, we have a situation where there's a different amounts of something separated by a barrier, that's a concentration gradient. And oftentimes in a cell, that's what occurs. You have a concentration inside the cell and outside the cell, and they might be different. And so the cell membrane constantly has created a concentration gradient, and things have to move across that membrane. So let's talk about diffusion. Diffusion is basically random movement of particles. And these particles are going to move from a high concentration to a low concentration without exerting any energy. Now we know in nature everything, all particles and atoms are moving all the time. They're bouncing off of each other, we just don't see it. So diffusion is just helping us explain and say what's happening to those molecules that are bouncing around all the time. And most of the time when there's a concentration gradient, things in nature want to reach equilibrium, which means the same amount. They want to remove that concentration gradient so there's an equal amount on either side. So if you look at the diagram I have up here with the bottle full of green dots, and on the outside of the bottle is a bunch of blue dots. Inside the container, there's a whole lot of green, and they are in a high concentration. I take off the top, and because they're high concentration inside, low concentration outside, they're naturally going to move, and they're randomly bouncing off of each other because that's how molecules move until they reach equilibrium. And that means there's equal amount inside as there is outside. Another very common example of diffusion is this perfume bottle here. You have a high concentration of the perfume inside the container, a low concentration outside in the atmosphere. You take off the top, and what's going to happen? The molecules inside from the high concentration move across to the low concentration. And again, it's just molecules bouncing off of each other randomly until they reach equilibrium. Another example of diffusion that you might be sort of familiar with is something like maybe when you're a little kid you played with a lump of sugar. You put it in a glass of something, and what happened is you have large concentration when you initially put it in, and then over time it spreads out until it's equally distributed through the molecule. And that occurs, you don't have to stir it up, but it's occurring naturally because those molecules are constantly bouncing off of each other in random motion. Another example would be if you put a drop of dye in a beaker of water. Initially, you have a large clump of that dye, and gradually over time, molecules are going to hit off of each other until it's dispersed all. Now, diffusion can be affected by temperature as well. So just like anything, in the temperature when something is cold, it slows down the molecule movement. So diffusion takes a longer time when things are cold. And like in heat, things speed up their motion. So when you heat up something, diffusion takes a much shorter time period. So let's look at this diagram. I have the left side and the right side. So hopefully, can you tell me where there is a higher concentration of molecules? Hopefully you picked the left, and that would mean the right side has a lower concentration of molecules. Where are they going to move? Hopefully you're going to say they're going to move from left to right, and you got that correct. All right, so let's talk about a special type of diffusion, and that is a big word, facilitated diffusion. And facilitated is a fancy word for helper. So sometimes the molecules that are moving or diffusing across a membrane are small enough to fit. Sometimes they're slightly larger, and they need some help to get across that membrane. So in order to do that, they're going to get help from the proteins that exist embedded in the cell membrane. And so this random movement of molecules, they're going to bounce off and hit those phospholipid balloons with the tails, and they don't fit in between. Every now and then they'll hit a particular protein, and they'll be able to slide like through. So facilitated diffusion is just helper proteins, what we call carrier proteins or ion channels, helping larger molecules to move across the membrane. Again, it doesn't require any energy, and an example would be something like the molecule glucose. Glucose is slightly larger than carbon dioxide and water, so it can't fit between the phospholipid heads and tails there. So let's talk about osmosis. Osmosis is, if you remember from middle school, it's the movement of water. And that would be the movement of water from a high concentration to a low concentration. Again, this is an example of passive transport, so no energy is required. So you have a high concentration, let's say on the outside, represented here by these water molecules, a low concentration on the inside of the cell, and they will move from high to low. And so osmosis is really just talking about the special water molecule diffusing across the membrane. And we give it its own special term because water movement is going to be very important to cells. And it's going to dictate a lot of times what's going on in your cells. So if we talk about the effect of osmosis on cells, we can look at this typical depiction of a blood cell. Now normally in a blood cell you have the same amount of water inside the cell as you do in the outside environment, and that's what we would like to maintain homeostasis or a balance inside our body. Sometimes, however, you get a little dehydrated maybe, and on the outside of the cell there's less water than there is on the inside. So if the cell has more water on the inside than it does on the outside of its environment, that water is going to move out to try and reach equilibrium. That's going to cause the cell to shrink, and that can be very dangerous, causing the cell to eventually die. Now the flip side, the opposite is also very dangerous too. Maybe you have too much water in your blood or too much solution or not enough water in your cells due to some kind of condition, and you get that water is going to flood that cell, causing it to swell. And that then could cause that cell to burst, and again that cell would end up dying. So too little water on the outside of the cell causes it to shrink. Too much water on the outside of the cell is going to cause it to swell and eventually burst. So the amount of water surrounding your cells makes a big difference into the health and the livelihood of your particular cells. And that's true for all living organisms. So the last thing we have to talk about now is active transport. And active transport, like the word describes, is actively transporting something inside. So active transport is an A and a T, so I think of it as ATP. It's going to actively transport something across the membrane. And it's usually going to move from a low concentration to a high concentration because the cell needs that item to be brought in. So if we talk about active transport, this is the first time it's going to require energy for something to move across. And in this instance, it's going to create a different type of concentration gradient. It's going to be moving from a low concentration to a high concentration. So if you look at our diagram over here, the bottom one, I only have a few particles here, lots of particles there. So I'm moving from a low concentration to a high concentration. It's against the norm. Nature doesn't usually do that. And so in order to get that to happen, I have to exert some energy. So I have to use up some of my ATP. So if you remember, in diffusion, up here I've got high concentration to low. Nature's going to naturally just move it across if it's a small enough molecule. But here, these are usually very large molecules. I have a low concentration on the outside, moving to a high concentration, and I have to exert my ATP or energy to get it in. So I'm going to be using carrier proteins, and these molecules are generally very large, and they're needed for some particular purpose in the cell. So in summary, let's look at transport across a plasma membrane. We had 4 types: diffusion, osmosis, facilitated diffusion, and active transport. Diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion all move from high to low. They don't require any energy. They all are a form of passive transport, and 2 of them, diffusion and osmosis, don't require any proteins to help them, but facilitated, remember that word means to help, need some proteins to move them across. Active transport, however, on the other hand, is going to move from a low to high. It does require energy, and it also requires a protein. So hopefully you've got all that down in your notes. If you have any questions, please make sure you write them down as well, and we'll see you in the class tomorrow.